All right, folks, so a little bit more about progressives.
As industrialization spread, the problems associated with it became harder and harder to ignore. Some members of the middle and upper classes saw the dreadful way the poor lived and
All right, so a note you should definitely jot down is that the progressives were mostly made up of middle class white people. Um, what you would call a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and they viewed themselves as the rational, intellectual, moderate between the somewhat lazy and diseased poor with who had a lack of a work ethic and uneducated, and the greedy wealthy.
wanted to do something about it. Many Americans did not know how bad the situation in factories and slums were until they read about it in the books and newspaper articles written by a group of writers who would eventually be called the muckrakers.
So these muckrakers would write books and magazine articles and take photographs in an effort to expose the poverty that people were living in, the living conditions, the working conditions. You know, you had Upton Sinclair write a book called The Jungle about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. All right, you had Lincoln Steffens write a book called The Shame of the Cities about political corruption in New York City. All right, so they were attempting to clean up the muck, hence the nickname muckrakers that was given to them by Teddy Roosevelt. It wasn't exactly a nice nickname. All right, he kind of thought of them as goody two shoes and too self-righteous. Now these progressives for a long time were viewed as just angelic and good guys. More recently, the historiography has become more complicated about them, and historians have begun in the last 10 to 15 years to pay more attention to their classism, the veil they were wearing when they were looking at the working class, but also the racism of progressives and how they tended to be in favor of segregation and anti-immigrant. Not all of them. That's part of the problem with these folks, if you want to call it a problem, is they were not monolithic. They were not one group of people who thought similarly. They were a diverse group. They all had kind of their pet reforms. Um, and historians even debate whether or not they were similar enough to each other to be called a movement.
Journalist Ida Tarbell wrote about the unfair business practices of the Standard Oil Trust. Lincoln Steffens exposed political corruption in the nation's big cities. Novelist Frank Norris published The Octopus, a story of California ranchers' struggles with corporate railroads. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, a powerful expose detailing unsafe and unsanitary practices of the meatpacking industry. The work of these writers galvanized the progressivists, most of whom were native-born, college-educated, middle and upper-class city dwellers. The progressivists sought immediate reforms, hoping to change society for the better, while preserving capitalism and democracy.
They also had a firm belief in the rationalism that comes out of the Enlightenment. They thought that you could think rationally and scientifically and figure out any problem. Whether it's rationally organizing a workplace to be the most efficient, or figuring out how many people can be inside a building and it still be safe, things like that. How to organize sanitation pickup, postal delivery. They were responsible for the civil service exam, where you got to take tests to become qualified to be employed in a certain job, like a police officer or a firefighter, a postal worker, so on and so forth. That's all the rationalization of social organization.
Not everyone was so swayed by the muckraking, however. It was Theodore Roosevelt who gave the muckrakers their name. He felt that the muckrakers were necessary to society, but also that they often went too far, focusing solely on the negative aspects of the issues they wrote about. But it was in Teddy Roosevelt that the progressives had their strongest ally. Roosevelt was a hero of the Spanish-American War and the vice president under William McKinley. Roosevelt was a headstrong and popular Republican and a known enemy of political corruption. Tragically, President McKinley was assassinated by a deranged anarchist in 1901. When Roosevelt was thrust into the presidency, corrupt politicians and businessmen knew they had a problem.
All right, so Roosevelt was a progressive president, but here's the thing. All right, Again, progressive help tended to come with condescension, um, blinders, and strings attached. All right, sometimes they would have settlement houses in cities, kind of like Reverend Pease's house, house of mission that he had in the 5 Points, where he was trying to reform society. So you can, in a way, you can think of progressives as Reverend Peace trying to help, but doing it in his thin, narrow way. Uh, but here's the thing. All right. Again, not all progressives were the same. The more white, male, and wealthy you were, the less helpful you were, the less willing to help you were. And Teddy Roosevelt would have fallen on that end of the spectrum. All right. The less wealthy, the less male, meaning the more female you were, probably the more helpful you were, and the less condescending you were. All right. So those settlement houses that used to be run by Reverend Pease, they weren't called that in the 1850s, but they were called settlement houses in the turn of the century. They were often led by women, all right, who lived in the neighborhood they were trying to reform. So there was a much stronger bond and alliance between a lot of female progressives than there were male progressives.
No sooner had Roosevelt been sworn in than he delivered an address to Congress, stating that old laws and customs were no longer sufficient in the face of the new social problems facing the United States. Roosevelt set out to convince the American people of a need for social change and gain support for his strategy, a strategy he called the Square Deal.
All right, so he referred to this new arrangement that with the American people, that the government should be a little bit more active in guaranteeing them fairness. He called it the Square Deal. All right, like, are we fair and square deal? And he's known as the trust buster. He's the president that most actively went after big business, and did break up a few, including Standard Oil, which today you know as ExxonMobil.